with China, it's and Russia more generally, it's very unclear. I think. There will be a mounting trade war. We don't know how far that will go. It'll partly depend on what happens on the ground. As I say, you can have lots of tariffs on Chinese goods. Doesn't mean that the Chinese export behemoth is stopped. It's like an oil tanker, very hard to turn around. All those supply chains that have China in the supply chains, or the cheap goods that American and British buyers want to buy. Are they going to give up those cheap goods for the principal stake of, factory workers in Sunderland or Ohio, who, probably won't even benefit anyway, because the chances are that production isn't going to come back. It's just going to be relocated to Vietnam or Mexico or other low-cost manufacturing sites. Um, so that whole trade war thing is much more uncertain. It's much more uncertain whether Biden or Trump can really follow through with trying to cut China out of its America's supply chains. JD Vance, I think, could be said to be the most anti-China politician who has stood for a major office in America, at least on the things he's said in the last year. I mean, he hasn't always been like this. I mean, we do have to say, without fear or favor, that when it comes to Republican presidential candidates at the moment, consistency is not, uppermost in their minds. But in the last few months, he has been saying, we do not like China. He actually said that in an interview. I do not like China. He is particularly critical of China's relationship with America. I mean, very specifically, it's not historically, in Vance's view, so much about China itself. It's about the fact that, in terms of his core constituency, he's trying to appeal to blue-collar workers in states like his own Ohio. And his line is that American capitalism, Wall Street, the big corporates, outsourced all their production to China, leaving the industrial heartlands of America a wasteland, and that is what is responsible for the decline of those American heartlands, the fentanyl crisis, and so on, that he has written about quite elegantly, if rather sort of through a single prism, if you like. And that's a very important issue. And to be fair to him, a lot of people in America would agree with him, I mean, not just Republicans. Indeed, opposition to this sort of globalization of industry, free trade first, has normally been something we associate with the left, but it's now come to be very much associated with this populist wing of the Republican Party. So that's going to be a concern to China. It's going to be a concern to a lot of those corporate interests which are still trying to do business in China. Now, the other side of that policy is that China is not so interested in having American businesses in China disrupting its own control of the workspace, if you like, of the industrial space, particularly information companies, which bring in ideas that China doesn't like. So on the one hand, it's very much a new look at US-China relationship that Vance is bringing, but also that's just really expressing, the way the world is going at the moment, which is much more skeptical on this relationship between US and China.
So just based on what they've said and your sense, would a Trump-Vance presidency look like for China? What are the threats and what are the opportunities?
So the big question that we're not sure about, I think, again, we have to distinguish what is said at these big events like Republican conventions and what is going to happen actually in reality. The big question is Taiwan, is the security posture. So US and China have been moving, under Biden's presidency. Although I say it's the Trump-Vance ticket that's blaming China for everything at the moment. It's under the Biden presidency that the greater likelihood of a clash over the Pacific, particularly over Taiwan, has seemed much more likely. Biden said for the first time that America would defend Taiwan from an attack from China. It's always been a strategic ambiguity, an area of strategic ambiguity, as it's called before now. Now, as I say, JD Vance has come out with some very anti-China stuff. He says we shouldn't be worrying about Ukraine. We should be worrying about the threat from China. Russia should be allowed to do not quite what it wants in Ukraine, but there should be peace in Ukraine, and all those American weapons that have gone to Ukraine should instead have been sent to Taiwan to defend itself. So the question is, again, to that very key point, is the Trump-Vance presidential ticket, if it gets elected, is it going to come to Taiwan's defense in those circumstances? Is it going to heavily invest in arms sales to Taiwan, in the American Navy patrolling the Western Pacific to deter China? Or are we going to see this more isolationist approach that they're also promising? Don't get involved in foreign wars. Don't poke your nose in where it's not wanted. Don't put American lives at risk for these countries a long way away. Focus on America first. So there's a clash in Trumpian Vance rhetoric there, and I think in China they're kind of nervous, and they don't really know what to expect what the reality will be. What's noticeable is the lack of comment in Chinese state media from Chinese official spokespeople about the Trump Vance ticket and the things it's been saying. It's been very cautious.
Really, the only message we've seen has been, please don't treat us as an election issue from the foreign ministry spokesman today.
A one-line statement. That's all it said is, "Don't make us the election issue," and and hardly any commentary this morning in Chinese state media about this at all. Just a one-line Xinhua, which is the Chinese state media, state news agency, just noting that JD Vance had been picked as Trump's running mate.
So the focus this week, obviously, with the plenum talking about China's economy, has there been any kind of public statement about these tariffs that Trump has talked about Biden's restrictions on certain goods being exported to China? Because these are all things that would feed into Chinese economic growth moving forward.
Yeah, now at the moment, that is the key question for China, and that's one of the big themes that is being discussed at this closed doors plenum. The very Chinese, Communist Party term for basically the annual get together of all the party leaders and technocrats, all the ministers, department heads, military leaders, and so on in Beijing. The main theme is economic. One of the main areas is this, incipient trade war, and both Trump and Biden now are competing with each other to announce tariffs against Chinese imports. Obviously, real in the case of Biden, who's put it in, for example, 100% tariffs on imports of Chinese electric cars, and Trump is also threatening very heavy tariffs across the board against Chinese goods. That is a concern to China. On the other hand, again, as I say, they've seen this rhetoric before. It hasn't stopped the rise of China. It hasn't stopped Chinese imports. When you look closely, these tariffs are being imposed currently on quite limited range of goods. What about iPhones, for example? A lot of our iPhones are made by a Taiwanese manufacturer in China. The laptop on which I'm talking to you was probably made in China, and so on. Are those everyday consumer items going to be hit by tariffs, or is it just these new areas like solar panels, green technology, electric cars? And if so, even with 100% tariffs, can America compete? The cheapest electric car on sale in China, made by BYD, the biggest Chinese manufacturer of electric cars, is on sale for the equivalent of $8,000. You can put 100% tariff on that, charge double that in America, and it's still, half the cost of a Tesla. Now, it's obviously not as good a car as a Tesla, but, do we really need to spend $40,000, $50,000 on a car when there's a runaround, on sale for, $16,000, $20,000? We know, look on your street, there'll mostly be cheap runarounds, not, Volvos and Audis. That still leaves a lot of room for growth. Last month, the most recent statistics showed that the trade deficit between China and America was its biggest ever. So amid all this trade war, the amount that America is importing from China is now its biggest ever. So rhetoric and reality. Let's keep the difference between those two in mind.
So away from Asia, from China and Taiwan, Gaza has been a big issue in this election as we head towards November. His first interviews, JD Vance has been incredibly critical of Biden for not finishing the war, for not supporting Israel enough. How do you sense this choice, this pick, will be being seen in Israel?
I think they're very pleased. I mean, unlike China, Israel is well, I should say, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, not Israel generally, but he particularly has made very little bones about who he prefers in American presidential elections. He's closely allied to the what you might call the Zionist wing of the Republican Party. There are a lot of ties between parts of the Republican Party and Israel and the IPAC, the pro-Israel lobbying group in America. That's been long-standing for some time, although there are plenty of the Jewish community in America support the Democrats, probably most even support the Democrats. But at a political level, a lot of right-wing Republicans have made clear their preference for a hard line in Israel by the Likud party led by Netanyahu. That's reciprocated. That wing of the Republican Party has really is dominant now under Trump, who used to be much more ambiguous and has occasionally been much more ambiguous about Israel and about Netanyahu personally. But those very pro-Israel, pro-Netanyahu voices are very dominant in the Republican Party now, even as Biden is facing this terrible conflict within his party between, as I say, it's parts of the party have had very long ties to Israel and to the Jewish community, particularly in New York, where and the East Coast, this sort of old Democrat heartland. But also the more radical elements of the, as they self-described it, radical elements of the Democratic Party are very hostile to Israel. They want a much more pro-Palestinian policy. Lots of calls within the Democratic Party and indeed quietly within the administration itself for a much tougher line on Netanyahu. So the Democrats are very divided on this. The Republicans have really swept away internal opposition to the pro-Israel policies generally pursued by Republican administrations and arguing for an even harder line.
One policy that Biden is associated with is the Saudi security guarantees, which kind of been pushed back by the conflict in Gaza in some ways. What happens with a Trump-Vance presidency to those Saudi security guarantees and to the wider region, to these questions about Iran, Saudi Arabia? What are these countries thinking about this morning?
Now, this is a fascinating question for people who follow the relationship between the Middle East and America closely, because so Saudi Arabia has this very ambiguous status in America. It's under the Republicans. Traditionally, the Saudi Arabia was a key ally. Remember, the Bush family had a very close relationship with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who some people may remember used to be the very long-standing Saudi ambassador to America. Was very close to the Bush family. He was even called Bandar Bush as a sort of joke. Since the events of 9/11, that's been a much more controversial issue in America. Bin Laden being a Saudi, obviously he was a Saudi. He was against the Saudi royal family and the ruling family. So in Saudi Arabia, this isn't seen as a contradiction, but this in America it is. So the Republican Party has become, more and more anti-Saudi, if you like. Whereas the Democratic Party, which has never liked Saudi Arabia very much, has more seen it as a way forward in the Middle East. So one of Biden's priorities was to broaden the sort of under the table alliance between anti-Islamist states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. So states in the Middle East, like the Gulf monarchies, which are hostile to this sort of the Hamas Iran axis of sort of quasi-democratic populist Islamism, I think you'd call it. I mean, I say quasi-democratic with a big emphasis on the quasi, but that dividing line in the Middle East, in the Arab states particularly, has been leapt on by America and by Biden to say, well, these are the new allies of Israel, which hopefully they can see the advantage of an alliance with these states, which will be dependent for those states on improving the outcome for the Palestinians. So this is a sort of win-all tendency for American politicians now to believe in, and that was kind of pioneered by President Trump under the Abraham Accords back in 4 years ago, where the UAE agreed to and Bahrain agreed to recognize Israel, in return for rather vague promises on better relations generally with the Arab community, particularly even in Palestine. We haven't seen much evidence of that at the moment, but Biden wanted to formalize that further. The Gaza war has kind of scuppered that because Israel doesn't want to make any concessions to Palestinians, and Saudi Arabia can't really go ahead with recognition of Israel under the current circumstances. But it has put off for everyone a rather difficult decision, which was part of that deal. What Saudi Arabia got out of that deal, that three-way US, Saudi, Israel deal, what it got out of it was things like nuclear technology for nuclear power stations, help in diversifying its economy away from oil, which it wants to do for fairly obvious reasons. And it was not at all clear how Congress was going to react to the idea of giving nuclear technology to a Islamic state that historically, American voters has not liked very much because of its internal policy, its its own particular brand of Islam, which has traditionally been hardline, though changing fast under the current rulers. So that was going to be a very difficult decision for the Republicans as to whether they would go along with that. And now it looks like they're not going to have to make that decision for the time being. But it might be a decision that Trump has to make, and we'll have to see what he does if he does get elected.
So January 2025 is Inauguration Day. Whoever comes to power on that day, what do you think will be the number one foreign policy issue at the top of their in tray?
Very good question. So, I mean, the relationship with China is, well, two things. I mean, one is Ukraine, right? So the question is, we know what will happen if Biden wins the election with Ukraine. That's fairly clear. The war will go on, aid will carry on being provided. At some point, one side will look like it's winning or losing slightly more definitively than is the case now. And at that point, there might be a move towards some sort of political solution. But so long as it's this sort of kind of grinding stalemate that we really see at the moment, then hard to know what the outcome there is going to be. If Trump gets elected, he says he will make a peace deal in 24 hours. Again, will he actually be able to achieve that? But if the mood music is very much, if Trump gets elected, then Ukraine will be forced to make territorial concessions in favor of peace. I think that's fairly clear what Trump will be asking Zelensky to do. So the only question then of how much of Ukraine is hived off into Russia. I mean, that's a fairly stark option, but that seems to be a fairly clear option for both. The outcome there is fairly clear if both Republicans and Democrats, Trump and Biden, keep their promises. With China and Russia more generally, it's very unclear, I think. There will be a mounting trade war. We don't know how far that will go. It'll partly depend on what happens on the ground. As I say, have lots of tariffs on Chinese goods doesn't mean that the Chinese export behemoth is stopped. It's like an oil tanker, very hard to turn around. All those supply chains that have China in the supply chains, or the cheap goods that American and British buyers want to buy. Are they going to give up those cheap goods for the principal stake of factory workers in Sunderland or Ohio, who probably won't even benefit anyway, because the chances are that production isn't going to come back. It's just going to be relocated to Vietnam or Mexico or other low-cost manufacturing sites. So that whole trade war thing is much more uncertain. It's much more uncertain whether Biden or Trump can really follow through with trying to cut China out of its America's supply chains.